Welcome to Morning Call, a podcast where we share our experiences around letting go of grief and learn to move with grace through mourning. We are your hosts, Alyce Christina
and Crystal Lee, two friends who connected through yoga and movement and ultimately found a deeper connection over our own parental losses.
We share how our experiences have informed us to live our lives more authentically, boldly, and in the now so that you can do the same. We believe where there is pain, there is transformation.
From the loss of a loved one to change in a career, a heartbreak, identity shift, and many other forms of loss, we walk this path together.
To discover the light within the darkness, we recognize the joy within pain and invite you to dive in with us as we share in the hope, laughter, and lightness of the mourning journey.
Join us for stories, interviews, and conversations that connect us as we explore the universal experience of loss that invokes the becoming of one's true self.
Welcome back to the Morning Call podcast. I'm your co-host, Crystal.
And I'm Alyce.
And today we have a very special guest. Her name is Juli Cher. She is a local Charlotte, North Carolina entrepreneur, businesswoman, and really a true intuitive and leaning into the spiritual side of things and leading that kind of duplicative entrepreneurial life and intuitive life. And I had the pleasure of meeting her as we were both exploring that spiritual side of things through a yoga trip in Iceland, which was amazing. And Alyce, I know that you also know each other through yoga. You want to expand on that?
Yeah, Juli and I met at Yoga One. So another, full circle here of meeting at one moment in life and coming back together in this moment of life, here to talk about your experience of grief, where that has led you, and how it shows up in life. Like, I know here at Morning Call, we share a lot that loss isn't just over the loss of a person, right? It can be a loss of a sense of self or a past version of ourselves, loss of community, and how these very distinct moments in our lives can inform and really how we choose to move with it, and creating that bigger conversation. So we're so excited to welcome Juli with us.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, anything else you want to add about your background where we jump into the big questions?
No, I think it'll all come up as we're talking. Yeah. I love the topic. Thank you.
Well, we're glad you're here. Thank you for being here. And there's many reasons we wanted you on the pod, but we'll start with one of them is I have learned through our friendship that you are in the process of working towards becoming a death doula. So will you maybe introduce your definition of what that is and then elaborate on your journey?
I'd never heard the term death doula before, and I think it was in like 2019. I was in a meditation, and just this came into my awareness, and I was like, what is that? And death is not really something that I would say that I had a lot of experience with. As far as the most death that I had really experienced as far as humans were my grandparents, 3 of them, but they were a lot older, so it just seemed like a natural transition. And it was interesting because someone met my dog and asked if he was a therapy dog, because he's just so chill and he's so cute and he's so nurturing. And so this kind of combination of this strange term that I did not know before, along with this awareness of my dog possibly getting into pet therapy, I was like, wow, what could we do then? And death is not something that, as I said, I've not spent a lot of time with. And so the feeling of this desire to become closer with death came about. And I was like, wow, this is interesting. So we went through the certification, and he he passed all of his tests. And so we started to work with hospice, which was, I was very nervous at first going in, because you're talking about people that are right on the brink of the transition of opening the door, the portal into the realm beyond this material world. And I started noticing my dog and just how he transitioned himself in this space. And he's always very nurturing and loving, but there was a certain type of reverence that he had when he would be with these dying patients. And something started to come alive within me with this. And I realized that there was a natural yearning to want to get closer to death, which was kind of scary to me at the time. This was pre-COVID. And so it was a little, yeah, it was a little scary to think about this desire to get close to death. And it has just evolved over the years of being willing to say yes to what's opening and the possibilities that were coming in. And so now we're 4, 5, like going on 6 years later. Um, it has been a really beautiful journey, not only within myself of the death that I've experienced in a variety of different ways, but then also coming in to support others who were in the dying process as well. So yeah, that's kind of my entry into it.
And has your work with, this is Jax, right? Like, because you're still doing this with him, and the therapy has been all in Charlotte mostly? Just curious.
Yeah, it has. We go between hospice facilities and memory care centers working with dementia patients. And so, yeah, we were just at one over Thanksgiving. It was, and it's really sweet. It's very, yeah, it's very rewarding. It's very nurturing going into these kinds of spaces because death is something that I feel like in our culture, we are it's not something that we celebrate. We don't celebrate death. We live in a bit of a society that has this underlying current of living forever. You know, all the ways to keep ourselves looking young, all of this new regenerative technology so that we can live beyond the expected, life expectancy. Um, we don't talk about death, and what I've noticed is what a shock to the system it is when individuals then are experiencing whether it's an egoic death or it is physical death of themselves or someone that they love.
Right, exactly. And that's one of the main reasons Alyce and I started this, is because we want to be more open and honest about death, since we live in a society that just tries to ignore it. And we're like, well, it's the one experience we're all going to all experience. And I mean birth, but none of us really remember that. So, we want to be more authentic about this journey that we're really all on. So have you experienced in your hospice work working with, like, have you met death doulas? Well, because I know they kind of work together sometimes. Yes or no?
Yeah. Well, so Death Doula has become an interesting pathway, right? There are several people that I follow on Instagram that are more clinical death doulas. So they are working with families, working with patients, and helping with any medical needs, helping people to navigate the hospice system. They're helping people to navigate what happens when a person transitions. So then you've got what is the funeral going to be like, taking care of the estate, and just a lot of that kind of the structure of how to transition through experiencing someone dying. And that's not the path that I am on. I'm not a nurse. I don't want to get into helping people logistically deal with death. I'm really more in the heart space. And so I'm not seeing a lot of that yet, although I do believe that it is growing in awareness in society of the path that I'm on is really more shepherding the heart through the death space. Yeah, and really how to, in the now, being able to work with the richness of all the emotions that come up when death is present, and then allowing the space for someone to experience grief, allowing people to experience different types of tools to experience grief. Because I'm a firm believer, I've experienced this now in my own life, that the better that I get at being able to work with emotions in the now, in the present, then I'm not storing that energy in my body. Because if I store it in my body, I've already learned I have to go back at some point in time to revisit this information, and I have to process it out of my system. So the death doula path that I feel like I'm walking right now is one of allowing the grief and the grief space to come about and to be able to process those emotions through the heart center.
Are you mostly working with and it might be, and it could be both, like the dying person and any loved ones, friends, family, whatever around them, mostly the dying person, both? What is like your journey with that?
Yeah, what's interesting, what's been showing up is that we go into hospice, so I'm bedside with these families, and where I've been working on an individual basis has actually been those to support those who are supporting someone in transition. So, for example, there was a gentleman that came into town, his mom, stage 4 cancer, and here he was in Charlotte without any of his natural resources and support systems, and was having to, choosing to be there with his mom as she transitioned. So I came in to help support him, really working with his nervous system, giving him space. Same with the woman whose uncle was murdered. And so it's been more of this space of working with individuals who are supporting someone that is transitioning.
Yeah, I mean, there's just so many things that you said, like, kind of rewinding to like this undercurrent you talked about of like the society that like, and it's also like around death, it's very fear driven, right? And I know from my own experience when I lost my mom, right? Like my thought was like, wait a minute, she was supposed to live forever. Like everything in my life had my mom in it and intertwined. And so it's been, you know, such an interesting experience, an insightful experience for me too, right? And then I remember like being in that process of like the logistics, right? And needing those logistics to be able to live, right? Like to understand that I was not the one that died, right? And even though she made this transition out of this physical life that we're currently in, that my transition was like, how do I integrate that into my living spirit, right? And really like just everything around like heart space, shepherding the heart, like I feel like that's my true north always. So I'm like, oh my gosh, we have to talk for hours. And I love it because it's like I've really identified, in this process in my own grief experience, like, how movement has played a role. And we're not just talking about physical movement, right? Identifying the bodies, and one of those is the emotional body, right? So shepherding the movement of your emotions, right? That enable us to be able to not just survive, thrive, right? Really thriving in the life that we're given here and now, and not waiting for the end moment, because the end moment, it's like, well, we're just dead. Like our vessel as we know it is gone.
Right.
Well, and it's working with the spiritual body too, because Julie, like when we chatted the other day, is similar to the birth and death discussion we had, Alyce, because Julie, you're working with the emotional body of those working with their own emotions around the grief and around the death and processing, and the spiritual aspect of an energetic body that is leaving the earth, because the energy is going somewhere, right? Like we have a physical body, but there's a spiritual energy. And it's like there's an emotional processing of that. Does it make sense what I'm saying? Like, because a lot of people are like, what happens with the spirit? What happens with the soul? And those are so intertwined, the emotional and the spiritual.
I just saw this post or read it, and it said that the spiritual body is absorbed by anyone that loved that person. And when you allow that spirit to be absorbed in you, you are the most powerful you will ever be. And I love that. What has been like the impact? I know it started out, I think, more as, correct me if I'm wrong, Julie, for your dog to be in this therapy role. What is that impact for people that experience, um, and the impact for you to see, our fur baby do such a miraculous, um, and offer a miraculous gift?
It is. I lovingly say that when we go into the hospice centers and the memory care centers, this is Jack's work. Actually, when we go in there, this is I'm just there because he doesn't have opposing thumbs and he can't drive, so I've got to I've got to get him there. Um, right, and he is just I mean, you could just see the reverence that he has and how he curls up into the laps. Over Thanksgiving, we were at a memory care center, and he just sat in the lap of this woman, and she just pet him and he just laid there. And this woman was just in so much joy and remembering her dogs, right? So the somatic experience of that, and then what it's bringing up in her recollection of memory was just so beautiful to see. And you were talking a minute ago about the spirit leaving the body. And I feel like this work I've always been, I would consider myself a spiritual person. And yet, how deep can you go into that well? And so I know that for myself, that just earlier this year, I was bedside with my own grandmother as she was transitioning and she was in hospice. And when the animation of the spirit leaves the body, you're right. Like there's something that is innately alive within us, that is this intelligence that is telling my heart to beat, that is telling my mitochondria to fire. Like there's so much happening of a higher intelligence that when this leaves, it's like, where does it go? And so that can definitely be such a contemplative place of those, as they're watching a loved one to die. And I love there's a Buddhist practice that at the time of death, when the spirit leaves the body, that there's a period of um, you know several days that the spirit is still traveling across the earth plane to go and visit those that the spirit loved. And so, to your point, Alyce, like of absorbing that spirit, the power and the love of that spirit. And so in the Buddhist tradition, then there's a chanting, a call, and a call is like death, no death, time, no time. And it's the the merging of the realms, where in this realm we have time, outside of this time doesn't exist. And so this chant is really to allow the spirit to ascend into the higher ethers, right, so that they can merge back into the oneness. And they say that in our own experience of death, to follow the cold blue light up the hill. That is what's taking you into the ethers, not to follow the warm light, that actually is the portal back into earth. So for my own sake, I'm like, yes, blue light. I love earth, but I could also probably use a few lifetimes of not being on earth anymore, like the Venusian planet of love that I can just, this planet is hard. It is really tough.
Oh, I love that. And I was like, there's I feel like the new meaning to morning call just was birthed in that description of like,
Calling us to the blue light, please.
Exactly.
That makes what I guess it just makes me think about what has the maybe spiritual, emotional impact on your own spiritual and emotional body been, being in the room with people dying, but also being in tune to those loved ones around them and their emotional and spiritual bodies, because you're absorbing that energy. We all absorb whatever energy is around us. Has it been like sacred? Has it been hard? Has, does that make sense what I'm asking?
Yeah, yeah. It's beautiful. There's reverence. There's an awe, right? Like my grandmother specifically, because my grandmother always talked of death. Like she was not afraid of it. She welcomed it. After my grandfather died, I guess she had about a 30-year period on Earth. And she was a beautiful woman and she didn't date. She would always tease, like even in her 90s, about all the boys at church, that were asking her out. And she was so beholden to my grandfather. And their relationship was such tender, exquisite love that they had. So she talked about death, of this excitement to reunite with him in spirit form. So she was not afraid of death at all. And so then to be bedside with her as she was rapidly declining, and I fully believe that my grandmother chose her time of death, right? She had, within a very short amount of time, she had two very, very significant falls. She broke her hip twice in the same place. And after that, it was this time last year. It was during the holidays last year. So we lost her in January of this year, and the rapid decline. And to see her in that space and the honoring, and how she was so bold, of like, this is the time. And even though in the last couple of days with her, that very last weekend, I got to spend a lot of time with her. And even though she was in a space she couldn't talk, she was so open to wanting to be touched. You could see like a little smile come on her face. I made a playlist for her of all of these spiritual hymns that she loved to sing. And as soon as I turned the music on, she like started up with Amazing Grace, like trying to sing it. And just, you could see, even in that space when maybe her full awareness was not there, you could still see the presence of this excitement that she had. And so for me, I think that the joy of then living that this has brought into my own reality of how precious this life is, no matter what's going on. Like, we all come through the birth portal. We all experience our own suffering. No one gets out of suffering. So no one's suffering on the planet is greater than anyone else's suffering, because we all have to go through it, and then we all die. And so in that space between birth and death and the suffering that we experience, for me and my own journey, it's just made everything so much more tender, so much more awareness of how precious it is, like so much more desire to be present with all of it, to not want to leave my body to escape into the future or dwell in the past, like to really, as often as I can, come into this present moment, because this is where everything is. And so I've loved it. I've loved where this work has taken me.
I think that's something the three of us, at least, and definitely some of the guests we've had so far, share is the, yeah, awareness is a great word, and awe that exploring death. I think people, it's like Alyce said, there's fear around death. Like, we don't talk about it because whatever the fear is. And I'm like, I feel like it's almost the opposite. Like, for me, and I think those of us on this call have, it's like opens up a whole nother plane of awareness, a whole nother like level of appreciation for life. And I'm like, no, it's like you're missing it. Like, if it's like the more we avoid death, I'm like, you're actually missing it. Like, if we talk about it more, if we open ourselves to the realm of discussion around it or whatever, like, I think it actually brings a sweetness to life.
We're conditioned to live in the worry and the fear and the doubt of, right, which actually hinders and restricts our ability to fully live, at least in my belief system. And when we see and approach and choose love, like the capacity to grow. It's like every time I'm hit with a wave of grief or miss or hurt or anger in my own process of grief, I can see it as my heart breaking, right? And I talked about this, like when my mom passed, like I couldn't be in the room anymore. I didn't want to be with her body because she was no longer there. Like that, her body was no longer the vessel of her spirit. And I just like, I sat down for the first time probably in what felt like 4 days of like her dying process and felt my heart just crumbling. But I had this intense pressure up and around my ribs that it just felt like it was catching all the pieces to my heart. And in the moment, I had no idea how I was going to survive or live, or, and it has been that process that those pieces have been put back together in a more grander, more generous, more compassionate, more passionate way than I could have ever imagined. And so now it's almost like an invitation in. I'm like, to maybe it's an invitation into that suffering, right? Of like, yeah, break my heart wide open again. So I get to walk through yet another door of more greater love I could have ever imagined.
Absolutely. One of my teachers, she says that an emotion, all it wants is the smallest space to be recognized rather than shoved down, pushed away. It just wants the tiniest space to be recognized. And she said that when we choose not to feel an emotion, especially the really intense ones, right? Like grief or rage, because I also work with people in that rage space as well, because it's a really juicy one. It's rage is often the portal into grief, or grief can be the portal into rage, and all of it is a portal into love. And so what she says is that when we choose not to feel an emotion, then we actually don't get to choose all the emotions we're cutting ourselves off from. Because if I'm cutting myself off from these emotions here, well, then I'm decreasing my bandwidth of the experience of emotion. So if I'm not going to be able to go deeper here, I can't actually feel all of the joy and the bliss on the other side. So I end up living in this small little world, this emotionless small little world. And so it's the same thing. The deeper that I've allowed myself to go into the experience of grief, or to go and to be able to channel my rage, then it's almost like a slingshot that happens, that I get to now move into these other realms of the expressions of pure love, which for me, all of the emotions are love, right? All of it is an expression of love. That grief is the deepest form to me of love expression, because it means that, like, I loved this thing, this person, and now it's out of my life. And it's like, oh, like the heartache and the heartbreak you said that comes along with that is just, it's its own portal into the experience of this human experience that take me there.
Yeah, it's like the more precious our own lives become, and we get to share that because we allow for the the magnitude of both expressions. And I just wrote the other day, like, grief holds joy as much as joy holds grief, right? And that is, you I believe we can try to know one and not the other, and the more we embrace both, right, the more expansive our expressions and our experiences can and will become.
And that's where I think that's the direction in which this work has led me, is that when someone is going through a very intense time, and as I've said, I've worked with people who are in the supportive, so their heart is breaking and needing to go into that grief space, but then also with other areas, because death shows up in many, many, many different ways. It's not just a person dying. I mean, it can be, yeah, moving, leaving a community, losing a job, a divorce, a breakup, you name it. Death shows up in so many ways. And so, what this has allowed me to is to notice in my own life all of the little micro deaths and really celebrating that, grieving those times, really allowing the emotion to come into completion. And so, this work has led me then into working with people as they're either going through a physical death of someone or an egoic death, of how to really get into that heart space to allow the heart to break open and then be able to feel it all the way through completion, and then allow for there to be a closure to that. That is, we're not aborting the emotion. We're not cutting it off, because then it's going to fester in the body and it's going to show up as disease, as pain. It's going to show up in the subconscious as projections and hurt. And so really allowing, to get into that space of the heart and feeling it all the way through is like, it's so juicy. It's so juicy.
Yeah, tell us about the time that you did, I guess, what you're calling a death ceremony for someone who was transitioning from like high school to college, right? Is that what it was? So it was like a death of one part of life into a birth of another part of life.
Yeah, it was oh, so beautiful. A good friend of mine, he reached out and said, "Hey, my son is heading off to college. This is a big transition in life, going from the boy to the man, going out into the world. Our culture doesn't really have a lot of these types of ceremonies of transitioning into adulthood, or becoming the man, becoming a woman, becoming an adult." And so he said he really wanted to do something to honor this. And so they invited me to come over, and we had this like beautiful conversation with the dad and the son. And you know, and what came about was, well, I asked them, I was like, how much creative freedom, like, do I have? And they were like, go for it. And I said, because they're both very Viking-esque, these two men. And so they're like tall, he's got this big structure, and his son's got this like beautiful long flowing hair, and they're just, and so what was coming up was a Viking death ceremony. And so oftentimes in Viking death ceremonies, then there's a death boat, and the person is put into the boat, and it's, off to sea, and then there are flaming arrows that go into it. So you've got the water, you've got the flames, you've got all of this, and it's just a really beautiful way of honoring a person's journey. So what they allowed me to do, it was so amazing. And everybody got into it. It was such sacred theater. So no one in the family knew what was happening. There were other siblings and the wife, mom. So no one else really knew what was going on. And I got to their house, and it was going to be at night. And so the dad and the son they dug a grave, right? So the two of them spent time together digging this grave. And then in the afternoon, the dad took his son out, and he essentially buried him. He had hours and hours of solitude of lying in this grave. It was it was an open grave, but he had also draped him, with this blanket, so he couldn't see anything around him. Really, just
Like almost like a death shroud or something.
Exactly. Yeah. So he was out there for several hours, just in this contemplative space. He'd been fasting that day. And so, everyone got into costume, kind of warrior Viking, makeup, and these cool masks. And the son and the dad had these arrows strapped on their back, and we did this processional, and I had this like Viking drum beat. So now, the son is, all he can hear is like this Viking drum beat. And so we had this, kind of a meditation and a prayer. And then each one of the family members wrote a letter to the boy he used to be. Being able to talk about like memories, or these are the parts of our relationship that I'm open to dying, right? Like it was, and I was so moved at just how just how sacred each one of them took the assignment, right? And so after they read, then they had something that represented their relationship with the son from that time of his boyhood. And they took it over, and they had a pool in their backyard, and we had a Viking boat, right? We had this really cool boat that was beside the pool. And so they would go and they would put the object in. Then the females, they unshrouded him, at the end of this sort of funeral service. They unshrouded him. They pulled him up out of the grave. The women were like dancing around him and carried him over to this place where we had this throne that was made. And then they put this cape on him. And then his dad had made this beautiful crown with all of these feathers coming out of it. So this whole time the son's still not said anything. So then he sits down, and we have got all these tiki torches all around him. And he's just like, you could just see this space of him just taking it all in. And so then each one of the family came up to him again and offered him a blessing of, leaving and moving out into the world and the becoming of the man, right? It was so beautiful. And so the dad went last. And the son he needed to find something that was really difficult for him to let go from his boyhood. And he had picked out something that he had made and, in his childhood. So the dad, after everyone spoke, then the dad, took him down. The father and son went down to the pool, and he had to put his relic into this boat. And so the dad happens to be an archer. It was so cool because just the music is going, and they're having this father and son, this beautiful moment, of looking over all of the things that everyone brought. And then they push the boat out into the pool, and then we all start coming down to the pool. And then my friend stepped back, and he whips out his arrow, and he lights it on fire, and he arches it, and it just perfectly arches up, and then he lands in the boat, and the whole thing just caught on fire. And we just stood there and watched it burn. And it was just, it was amazing. It was amazing to be able to curate that. But more importantly, it was amazing then to just see just how much this will be an experience that he will be telling his children, his grandchildren about, and not from I curated this, from his desire. And so his desire, how it manifested into this beautiful ceremony and what it meant for him. And so it's funny because after that, all the kids were like, we want to do something too. We want our own ceremony. So it was, I would love to do more of these. Yes.
The start of a new tradition, right? Again, somewhere along the way, I just saw something about to be able to be at your own funeral, right? And celebrate the life that we have lived and accomplished. And that is something we so often, we're in such a culture of what's next? What's next? Or I have to do more. I have to do more. We so frequently forget to celebrate where we are, what we've accomplished, big or small. And and to be able to create, I'm I want to do that for my daughter. I talk about constantly, every time she's changed schools, and that is a loss of community, right? And that she still talks about her pre-K kindergarten teacher from Park Road Montessori, and how much of an impact that, her teacher had on her, that there's still a little bit of, it's her mourning what that time in her life was, and that how special to involve your family, involve the people that are contributing to you day in and day out to celebrate. And I feel we do that for birthdays in a way, but again, we get so caught up in, oh, what's the gift? What is the gesture? Right. Instead of an internal becoming of oneself.
And there's nothing wrong with focusing on like, the rebirth part of it, like the next step. But I don't think we do enough in our society of the honoring of the what is or what was. And we are Mother Nature. We are cyclical beings. Um, we have seasons just like the earth does, right? And just like the weather and all that. So I feel like we do a bad job of honoring our own cycles and only focusing on the forward and not saying like, this was the time of shedding and like honoring the beauty of that while also like, I feel like they can be held at the same time while also honoring what's coming, And Julie, I think that you curated such a beautiful space to do all of the above. So I would love to hear like if you do more of this for sure.
I do. I more.
I think you have your first customer with Alyce and Miss Amelia. So your next customer.
Well, even when you started sharing, about this experience after, losing my mom was, I lost many people in my life prior to my mom. And, for whatever reason, I mean, I know, it was my mom, and being there by her side in the experience of the death process just opened up a door for me, in a way. And then I have been able to reflect and go back to and re-mourn the loss of all of those people prior to me, my grandparents, my aunts, my uncle, great aunts and uncles, like all of these funerals I had been to as a child. It had a different feel for me to it. And then to also, I realized I never gave myself the opportunity to mourn or grieve the my divorce, and that relationship, or that version of myself that I, probably cast a lot of shame or blame around, and was finally able to be like, oh no, girl, you've forgiven, right? Like this is just a part of the process and a part of my experience, my story, that is offering these gifts that I can then share with others, and that I use in my life now, which I love. And why not put a celebration around it, right? Right? Why not? Like, yeah,
Yeah, and Julie, I know that you're like specifically this past year for you has been with your grandmother and businesses kind of changes, right? Um, there have been a lot of those life shifts that they're not, well, your grandmother was a death, but there's other things that have happened that are more of those other types of deaths. So is there anything like Alyce is talking about with her learnings? Is there anything else you want to share with any other parts of changes of your life?
Yeah, I mean, I think that when I was a yes to this kind of path and what it could be, I can't just say I want to work with people and as they're transitioning with death and not have experience myself with death. And so, whew, yeah, I didn't realize like saying yes to a death doula path means that I'm saying yes to all of this death in my own life. And so, yeah, just in this last 15 months, I had an opportunity. Someone made an offer on a house that I had been living in for 20 years. And that was the longest I'd ever lived anywhere in this one house as an adult. Prior to that, the longest I had ever lived anywhere was maybe about 3.5, 4 years max. And so growing up, my dad was with corporate America. And so we would tend to move about every 18 to 24 months. There was one period where in 5 years, I was at 5 different schools. And so when all of a sudden I had this opportunity to move last year, it was completely unexpected. I said yes to the offer, and then I asked them. They wanted a really quick close, And so I asked if I could stay in the house like an additional, it turned out to be like 45 days past the close. And for that 45 days, I mean, I was dropping into all of these little versions of me that, this is the 80s, right? Like we didn't have cell phones and TikTok and all of these ways, that we can stay in touch. You wrote letters. And eventually, as a, 8, 9-year old kid, 10-year old kid, you're like, you get bored of writing letters, right? You're just going to be in the now with your friends outside and playing. And so I had a chance to go back to all these little versions of myself that each time we moved, I lost community. I lost, the neighborhood. I lost the school. I lost the church. I lost, just continually being uprooted, right? And so to be able to go back and to touch those parts of me as I'm going through this experience of transition was so powerful. Um, Experiencing closing a business that, and not having another business open yet and being in that void of income and manifesting money because we have to pay to live on this planet, right? And so it was like, you're right. And so it's like, but I had to close the one business so that the other business opportunity that has come into being would have an opportunity to be born. So in all of these, it's been simultaneously being in the death and the grief of what is ending and coming to full closure, while also being in the space of everything's being rebirthed, right? So it is creation happening. I mean, we see it as right now in the Northern Hemisphere, we're transitioning into winter. The trees are going dormant. Things feel cold and they feel dead, only then to see the spring come and the rebirth of summer. And so, being able to be in that own experience in my own life of things coming to an end, parts of me that will never exist again. They've torn the house down that I lived in, so it's gone. I can never go back to that version of me. The business that was open for 13 years, that's gone. I can never go back into that version of me. So it's been a really interesting year of things coming to an end, but also being in the rebuilding and the rebirthing of this new version of my life that I'm getting to experience. And so it's been, yeah, it's been a hell of a year. It's been a lot. My grandmother died in that process. Last year I had a friend of mine, one of my dearest friends, he committed suicide. And I was asked to speak at his funeral. And he had a lot of family coming in, even though he was not in the Jehovah's Witness religion anymore. Most of the people coming, family wise, were Jehovah's Witnesses. And I remember one afternoon, like crying out of like, Greg, I don't know what to say. Like, how am I supposed to speak about suicide to those who look at suicide as being something that is insidious? And I remembered it was really as if he like came into the presence, and I just started writing and writing and writing. And after about 12 pages, then I was like, oh, wow, then that's what thank you. That's what we have to say. And so to be able to stand up and speak then, and honoring suicide, honoring the courage that this man had of opening his own death door, right? He wasn't waiting for a life to happen, to take him into that. He, with courage, he opened the death door. So really coming into, this last year, 18 months has been filled with so much death, but it's also been so alive.
Yeah. Well, and you've been through the work you've been doing, you've been laying like a foundation and some groundwork to be with your friend Greg, like afterwards, right? Like being attuned to his spirit after the fact, so you can tune into him sending those messages. You've laid some groundwork to be able to be truly present with your grandmother and feel her energy, right? Like I just think that, you know, you're doing the work to support all these like spiritual beings and energetic beings. And I mean, I don't want to speak for you, but I feel like it's may possibly helped you through this past like 15 months. Yeah.
Yeah, without a doubt. I mean, I I truly believe that we live in this beautiful world, this material world, right, of matter, where we have these uh, electrons and protons, and creation of atoms and molecules, and all of it at the end of the day is really an illusion. Like the table in front of me, it looks like it's wood, but it's just like molecules that have bonded together to create wood. And so for me, the the more that I've allowed myself to open to the possibility that there is something that is so magnificent, that is the bonding agent of all of these molecules, right? That creates skin and hair and buildings, and recognizing that um, there's something inside of all of this that's that's really the conductor of all of this, and that it is a loving and compassionate, intelligent human being, or not human being, but just as loving, compassionate, intelligent being, allows me then to just lean into the process of death even deeper, because um, mm, because at the end of the day, um, until we die, we really don't know what is on the other side. So there's no religion that's going to tell me, there's no human being that's going to tell me, you go to hell, you go to heaven, you go wherever. It has really come into a basic trust that I have, that this intelligence is designed for the greater good of all beings. And then we happen to live in a world of polarity, right? In order for things to magnetize together, then that polarity, that positive and negative, have to come together. So then people say, well, how do you reconcile death and what's happening in, you know, Gaza, with what's happening when there's famine and drought and natural disaster? Hurricane Helene that just wiped out like so much of our friends in Western North Carolina. And it's like, you know, we live in this world of polarity. So therefore, there's going to be experiences of bliss and joy, but there's also going to be experiences of deep grief. And so you know, I can't say for certain of why the bad things happen. I just have to honor that for me, when those things have happened in my own life that have caused such deep grief, and there have been a lot of them, that when I've been willing to go into that wound of myself, there's so much wisdom, there's so much richness, there's so much then that allows me to show up in a different way in this human form than if I just cut myself off and I'm like, the world is terrible, the world is mean, there's all this badness that's happening out there. Then that's what I'm going to focus on, and then I forget that there's also this beautiful warm sunshine that's coming down. There's laughter that I get to experience. There is community that I get to be part of. And so I've just come to find that the more that I'm willing to experience it all in its fullest form and not label things as being bad or good, then this whole experience of being a human becomes even richer.
Absolutely. Yeah, I love the concept of polarity. And you said earlier, like a slingshot, like you really cannot have one without the other, because how would you recognize joy if you haven't experienced the opposite of it? Do you know what I mean? Like,
Amen. Yes, sister.
um,
Yes. Yes.
I was going to say the like three overarching themes. I feel it's like in the process of embracing death, there's hope, right? There's hope that there is life beyond what we know. And there has to be a trust in it, right? And we have to trust in each other, right? That we're not doing this alone, right? And we have to trust in ourselves of aligning to our highest call, because everyone's different. And then at the end of the day, like it's a choice. Either we can not live in this life, right? By getting, just bogged down by the fear, or we can choose to love in the suffering, in the joy, and in every single moment in between, and truly live to make, the the big or minor difference that we can while we're here on this earth. Because as much as I want to solve, you know, world hunger or, you know, peace, you know, give everyone the experience of peace, like, I have to trust that my little part will have ripple effects.
And don't you find too that I know with my own experience, the more that I'm willing to go into my own suffering and my own pain, the empathy that it creates when I'm experiencing someone else going through suffering. It's also relieved me of needing to, like, yeah, I can definitely say like that need to save people was very prominent in my life for many years. And the deeper that I go into my own suffering, it actually relieves me of the need to try to save others. Yet I can be in such deep empathy and sit with their suffering, not trying to change their suffering to make myself feel better, because that's really what savior complex is like, I need you to not do this so I feel okay. And so it's allowed me to expand my own capacity to be able to sit with others as they're moving through their own suffering and not try to change it, and just accept that it's also part of their growth. My suffering has been one of the greatest catalyzers of my own expansion, my own growth. And so I'm robbing that of someone when I'm going in to try to save them. Yet, like, the empathy that my heart has, because it's like, oh, I know how much your heart is breaking because mine has broken so much too. So let's just be here together.
Yeah, and at the end of the day, we really don't have control. And when you are comforting someone, no matter what loss, whatever experience they're having in this life, most of the time we really can't save them, in quotes. We really can't change their situation drastically, right? Like we might be able to help them in certain ways, but I think sitting with people at the end of the day, at least in my own grief specifically, it's like there were no magic words, there's no magic actions. You're not going to bring my dad back. That's it. Like, so the sitting with really is the change. Being with, you know, yeah, it is the medicine.
It is medicine. Yeah.
Well, I know we probably need to wrap up soon. I mean, first of all, I would love to have you back. Would you come back at some point on the podcast again? Because I know like you're going to have more of these death ceremonies. I know like the business is going to change, and you know, we want to hear all we want to hear all about that.
This death and rebirth process.
Well, really, hurry up and be reborn.
Right. It's like just, I mean, the surrender. I don't know about you guys, but I just know that the so much of grief and transition and change, whether that's in the physical or the egoic form, is the surrendering into it. And what I have found in my own experience is the deeper that I'm willing to surrender, then the softer the experience has the opportunity to be. Because when I'm in resistance, like I'm pushing, that's that's an energy in and of itself. But the surrender doesn't mean that I have to necessarily like love it, but I can accept that this is happening. There is a reality that is happening with me, and that by just allowing myself to just melt into it, then I find that there's a different type of grace that comes along with that.
I was like, there's a grace. That was exactly, I was like tracking right there with you. And that is huge. There's the grace that we can offer, which then, I mean, it's all tied together, which then allows us to have empathy for ourselves to then have empathy for others, therefore creating more understanding and a greater sense of belonging. Thank you for joining the Morning Call podcast. Our intention is that you found a nugget of hope, inspiration, connection, or all of the above.
If you seek to dive deeper with the Morning Call community, email us, subscribe to our page, leave a review, and fill out our survey.
We want to hear your stories and widen the conversation to support and empower our grief experiences as we collectively become our true selves.
Find us and subscribe on all streaming platforms, YouTube, and at Morning Call Podcast on Instagram. You can also email us at morningcallpodcast@gmail.com.
This podcast was edited by Alexis Carrasquillo from Familia Creative Media.